Okay. Okay, hello, good morning, UConn students, educators, and community members, and welcome to the third day of the first annual Human Rights Symposium. My name is Priya. I'm a human rights student here at UConn, and like many of you here today, I have a passion for human rights issues that affect migrant communities and refugee communities. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today to bring awareness to these specific issues. Today will be a day dedicated to border, immigration, and refugee crises, and a call to attention to the struggles faced by migrants at the southern border and asylum seekers all over the world, especially in light of the pandemic, which unfolded in 2020 and of course continues into today. We hope to encapsulate this topic through expert speakers, interactive workshops and panels, and culturally relevant materials. As some of you may know, 2020 has been a very tumultuous year for the migrant community all over the world, especially in the face of COVID-19. Refugee crises are just that, crises. But when paired with the global pandemic, refugees face harsh circumstances such as food insecurity, water scarcity, the inability to work, just to name a few. And as a result of faltering economies and coronavirus outbreaks in some countries where many refugees flee from, such as Afghanistan, were being forced back to their countries, which many were not prepared for. Here in the United States, migrants, especially those fleeing extreme violence from Central American countries, are faced with inhumane treatment at the southern border, especially over the past couple of years. The former Trump administration's policies, including zero tolerance and family separation, which greatly affected a vulnerable population within migrant communities, children. For those trying to enter the United States, the majority want nothing more than safety, but faced with dangerous conditions when entering the United States puts them in a very difficult situation. Now, these are dense issues that require a lot of unpacking. This topic by no means can be boiled down into the span of several hours. We dedicate this time and space for education and discussion, but remember that social justice advocacy goes way beyond this. There's always room to learn and grow, and we hope this day will raise awareness to this issue and encourage many of you to keep learning, engaging with, and challenging ideas. It's folks like you all who put aside time to be here today that will be making a difference in the world tomorrow. So to start off our day, I'm super excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Denise Bell. As we were planning this day, I came across Denise through Dr. Sandra Sirota, who is one of my professors, part of the Human Rights Institute right here at UConn. So we're very excited to have her and her expertise with us here today. To give a little introduction, Denise Bell is a researcher on refugee and migrant rights at Amnesty International, USA. She's authored reports following missions she's led in the US and the Middle East. Her portfolio also covers COVID-19, technology, corporate accountability, and the right to peaceful protest. And she served as a senior campaigner for refugee and migrant rights at AIUSA, campaigner for the Darfur Campaign, and a country specialist for Sudan. And she's worked on forced displacement issues since the mid-1990s. So thank you so much, Denise, for your time and being with us here today to help foster dialogue around this very important issue. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Priya, and good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to be here. And I'm also honored to be the keynote speaker for the University of Connecticut's first annual Human Rights Symposium. Thank you to the university, Priya, Diana Velasco, and my dear friend, Sandra Sirota, for inviting me and entrusting the opening remarks to me. Again, it's an honor. I only regret I can't be speaking to you in person. I want to begin by noting that the past year has been incredibly tough and challenging, not just for human rights activism, but for all of us and our loved ones on a personal level. Thank you for all of your continued advocacy in these times and support for human rights. I'd like to first give an overview of what brought me to this work, the ecosystem over the past years in both the US and globally for refugee and migrant rights, before turning to the human rights framework, the impact of COVID-19, and what the Biden administration's stated commitment to human rights and racial justice means for refugee and migrant rights. I feel like I'm back at my roots. I started my career in a PhD program in history to become a professor. I'd like to think that if I'd stayed that path, I would have been fortunate enough to teach at an institution like the University of Connecticut, which prides itself on community engagement and service, such as with the symposium. I saw being a professor as a form of service, and so it's one more pleasure to be here today at the symposium. Working with Amnesty International is its own form of public service. I like to think. I do know that I love my job. I work every day to demand and ensure that governments respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. I can't believe I have the incredible opportunity of doing this work, of using my privilege to create the space for others to speak for themselves, to shine a light on stories which would not be heard, to hold governments accountable for their human rights violations, to defend human rights, and I believe to create systemic change. I've been with Amnesty in various capacities since 2004, starting out as a local group member who wanted to take action to stop the atrocities in Darfur in Western Sudan. At the time, it was known as the first genocide of the 21st century. I sat on my navy blue futon at the corner of 23rd Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan and thought, what can I do? What organization will be working on this? And true story, I thought Amnesty International. And so began my journey. I joined local group 11, ended up creating an economic activism campaign for Amnesty, again, as a volunteer, that was taken on internationally. And then I was hired to run it. I like to think I am the story of what Amnesty stands for, grassroots activism, what a concerned individual can do with their compassion, commitment, and desire to support human rights. Amnesty invests in everyday people so they can become agents of change. But I also must admit that doing this work is challenging. It's hard to create change, and it's hard on the soul. This has never been more true, or so it seems, than over the past 4 years. I focus on refugee and migrant rights in my daily work, and I've worked on this issue area for a number of years. I was with the U.S. Department of Justice most recently, before returning to Amnesty in 2016. First as the senior campaigner for refugee rights, and now as the researcher. And I have to say, over the past 4 years, advocates and lawyers in this space, but most importantly, immigrants and refugees themselves, have lived with crosshairs on their backs. Under the prior administration, refugees and migrants were the target of a daily diet of dog whistles of racism and hate, if not explicit anti-immigrant, anti-refugee statements and tirades. Some days I'd just stop and I would cry. The prior administration set about deliberately and systematically dismantling the refugee program and asylum system in the US and dehumanizing immigrants and refugees. It was shameful, it was persistent, and it caused irreparable harm. It also caused multiple and recurring human rights violations. From the Muslim bans to the policy of forcible family separations, to the return in Mexico policy, to prolonged and indefinite detention, to the public charge rule, to name only a few, the prior administration violated the rights of refugees and immigrants repeatedly. Why? To deter them from coming here, to punish them for being here, to create fear in their daily lives. The administration scapegoated immigrants and refugees instead of addressing real societal issues and to divert attention from political ill will. We cannot underestimate the harm the previous administration did to the U.S. refugee program, how it dismantled the asylum system, and how pervasively demonizing refugees and immigrants corroded social bonds in this country. Dehumanizing people because of their identity works like an acid on the ties that bind us as a community, and our civic health has frayed. Lost in the politicized debate and fear-mongering is one simple fact. Refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants They are not numbers. They are women, men, and children with unique stories to tell. And lives as well, their own lives. I've interviewed parents, children, teachers, artists, engineers, laborers, and homemakers living out the abrupt shift in US policies. People stuck in limbo, anxious, fearful, and uncertain why the US is targeting them. I've spoken to people living in refugee camps in trailer-like structures or makeshift accommodations in dense urban environments. Others living in prolonged and indefinite detention. All they want is what any person in their situation would want: safety, a place to call home, work to support themselves, and education for themselves and their children. They want to live with dignity. Amara, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, told me, "We don't want to think just about food and our basic needs. We want to live lives." Alejandra, a transgender asylum seeker from El Salvador, told me, "As an older trans woman and as a fighter for LGBT, I'm a fighter all the way into the last day that I am on this earth." A generation of families and individuals bears the weight of the US's discriminatory policies. We must remember their stories, lift up their voices, and create the space for them to be heard and advocate for their rights as we fight alongside them. We must remember every person has the right to seek asylum, and all people have the right to leave their country, to migrate. Refugee resettlement is a lifeline, and equally so, all people have the right not to be discriminated against. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights outlines these obligations, and a series of treaties and conventions and other instruments lay the framework for a body of international human rights and refugee law. The US government has an obligation to ensure that the human rights of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And yet the government failed. Not only did it violate its human rights obligations, it violated its own laws. But the US was not alone. The international system of protection was put to its greatest stress test over the past 4 years, not only because of the Trump administration, but also because of a successive wave of authoritarian, xenophobic, and nationalist rule around the world. It was a collective turning in and turning away to our human rights obligations and our moral commitments to one another as people, our common humanity. And while the retrenchment in protecting the rights of refugees and migrants was not uniquely American, the US administration's lack of leadership, or rather its harmful leadership, had a knock-on effect around the world. Refugee resettlement plummeted, borders were closed, asylum seekers and migrants were pushed back, and immigration detention soared. Yet a system fracturing endured, and now it's time to build it back better, imbue it with more resiliency, and create a more equitable and just society based on compassion, dignity, human rights, and racial justice. Our collective commitment will be necessary to make that promise real. So, what are the human rights at play here? As I mentioned earlier, the US government has an obligation to ensure that the human rights of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are respected, protected, and fulfilled. In fact, this obligation to protect people seeking safety is a bedrock principle of domestic and international law. The international community came together in a commitment of solidarity and legal protection for refugees and asylum seekers through the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its accompanying 1967 protocol. The 1951 Convention establishes the definition of refugee, the right to seek asylum, and the requirement of non-refoulement, the prohibition on the forcible return of people to places where they would fear persecution or serious violations of their human rights. The 1967 protocol to which the United States is a signatory, extended that requirement beyond the context of the war. This is pathbreaking the convention and its protocol. And cutting across all international human rights conventions, treaties, and instruments is the right to non-discrimination. Discrimination is prohibited on grounds including nationality, ethnicity, sex, gender, race, and religion. And I love this part. The US so believed in these human rights, these refugee rights, it took international human rights law and made it US law. In 1980, the US passed the Refugee Act, codifying the Refugee Convention and Protocol into domestic law. The 1980 Refugee Act established the modern US refugee program and asylum system. Under US law, every person has the right to seek asylum, both at and between ports of entry along the US border. In other words, it doesn't matter where or how you enter, you have the right to seek asylum. So, in a nutshell, the right to seek safety is US law. And then when you enter the US, you have the right not to be arbitrarily detained in immigration detention. Under international human rights standards, the presumption is liberty. Detention should only be used rarely in exceptional circumstances after alternatives are examined first. So that's very important. People have the right to seek safety, no matter how they enter the country, and they have the right not to be detained arbitrarily. Refugee resettlement is slightly different. It's provided for in law, but not required. In other words, it's discretionary. A fundamental principle of refugee protection is responsibility sharing and international cooperation. These are required to reduce the impact of large-scale refugee populations on host countries, and each state, including the United States, should contribute to its maximum capacity. Resettlement is a lifeline for refugees and a key component of responsibility sharing that allows states to support each other by agreeing to resettle refugees from host countries. Since the 1980 Refugee Act established the refugee program, the U.S. has historically resettled the largest number of refugees annually. From 1980 until 2017, U.S. administrations have, on average, set the goal for refugee resettlement at 95,000 refugees per year. The admission goal for fiscal year 2021, however, under the previous administration was set at 15,000, the lowest goal ever set by any administration, and accompanied by discriminatory limits to the types of refugees who could be resettled. All of this is important to understand for two reasons. Not only is there an international human rights framework on the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, there is an intentional and robust body of U.S. law and precedent surrounding these rights. When we talk about what it is possible to do and what was harmed, we are referring to both sets of law, international and domestic. It's not often we can point to the U.S. government's legal responsibility for human rights, but we can here. Let me be clear. The immigration system suffered under all administrations. Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. This isn't about one person, one president, or one party. The U.S. has a bipartisan reflex to use immigration law to criminalize people, to deter people, to try to circumscribe their rights. Refugee resettlement has fared better, perhaps because it served national security interest as well as humanitarian interest, and because U.S. global leadership after World War II was cemented in this space, and successive administrations continue to lead. And having said all this, the past 4 years have been the most concentrated form of harm. The prior administration attempted to roll back more than a century of immigration, human rights, and civil rights law and policy to reshape the country to what it was at the turn of the 20th century. There are some consistent themes over the past 4 years. Discriminatory policies intended to radically narrow the ability of people to immigrate here, to drastically reduce, if not totally eliminate, the ability of people to access the right to seek asylum, to strip the ability to be released at all from arbitrary immigration detention, and to virtually zero out refugee resettlement. It sounds like a nightmare because it was. The prior administration took a sledgehammer to the machinery of immigration and refugee law and then stealthily dismantled what was left through a series of policies and administrative acts. And against this backdrop, COVID-19 swept through the world in 2020. The pandemic has exposed the terrible legacy of deliberately divisive and destructive policies that have perpetuated inequality, discrimination, and oppression, and paved the way for the devastation wrought by COVID-19, not only in the US, but also around the world. COVID-19 amplified decades of inequalities, discriminatory policy, and erosion of public services, neglected health systems, and patchy economic and social support. Existing inequalities and the enjoyment of economic and social rights, and a culture of entrenched discrimination left some groups of people disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Already in a precarious situation, refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers were among those disproportionately affected. Yet, the pandemic didn't stop wars, humanitarian crises, and persistent human rights violations, and millions of people continued to be forcibly displaced. The numbers tell a horrible story. Nearly 80 million people were displaced, 26 million of them refugees, 46 million internally displaced persons, and over 4 million asylum seekers. This is an unprecedented humanitarian challenge and scale of displacement. In response to COVID and in response to the rights of people seeking safety, countries closed borders, increased immigration detention and deportations, and delayed or suspended processing asylum requests and refugee resettlement. Many refugees and migrants were particularly at risk of COVID-19 as they lived in overcrowded, insalubrious detention facilities, camps, or squats. The most emblematic case was perhaps the Moria camp on the Greek island of Lesbos, where a fire left 13,000 refugees and migrants without shelter. Border closures stranded asylum seekers and deprived seasonal workers and labor migrants of subsistence wages and their families of remittances. Let me give some examples of the worldwide effect before turning to the US. First, border closures left refugees and migrants stranded. For example, in Uganda, the largest refugee hosting country in Africa with 1.4 million refugees, it immediately closed its border at the start of the pandemic and did not make an exception for refugees and asylum seekers trying to enter the country. As a result, over 10,000 people were stranded along its border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some governments, including Canada, Peru, and the USA, prohibited the entry of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants altogether throughout the year. Forcible returns. Many countries, including Croatia, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, and the USA, forcibly returned people without proper consideration of their refugee and asylum claims. In 42 of the 149 countries Amnesty International monitored for our annual report for 2020, just released, refugees and migrants were subjected to refoulement, which again is the forcible return. That's 42 of the 149 countries we surveilled. There were restrictions on movement and pushbacks and violence and land at sea borders. Turkey weaponized refugees and migrants for political purposes by encouraging them to travel from Turkey to Greece's land border, sometimes even facilitating their transport. And when they arrived at the Greek border, Greek authorities committed human rights violations against them, including excessive use of force, beatings, use of live ammunition, and pushbacks into Turkey. This was a political ploy by Turkey to extract concessions from Greece and the European Union. Roma and people on the move, such as refugees and asylum seekers, were placed under discriminatory forced quarantines in Bulgaria, Cyprus, France, Greece, Hungary, Russia, Serbia, and Slovakia. Governments throughout Southern Europe prohibited ships in the Mediterranean from disembarking rescued migrants and refugees, leaving them stranded at sea for records period of time. And then they would return them to North African countries such as Libya, where they were subjected to human rights violations. And on top of all of this, the European Union began discussing a new migration pact to further deter migration during a pandemic, during a humanitarian crisis, to further push migrants back instead of honoring and upholding their human rights. Relief and access to healthcare and employment was restricted. In South Africa, the government's COVID-19 social relief programs excluded refugees and asylum seekers during the first half of 2020. Afghanistan's 4 million internally displaced people who were already living in precarious conditions before the pandemic faced increased difficulties in accessing basic health care and amenities. Meanwhile, nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh faced further restrictions, with COVID-19 aggravating an already overburdened healthcare system in the camps. Many refugees, migrants, and internally displaced people already at heightened risk from COVID-19 due to overcrowding in camps and detention centers also face restrictions on their movement, limiting their access to employment, protection, and the ability of humanitarian workers to deliver aid. Migrant workers suffered as well. The pandemic aggravated the ability of migrant workers to be able to work and heightened their already vulnerable situation across the Middle East, while some Gulf countries brought in measures to waive penalties for migrant workers overstaying visas because they couldn't return to their home countries because of the pandemic. Many migrant workers also faced arbitrary dismissal from their jobs and were not paid for months. In Jordan, thousands of migrant workers who lost their jobs rarely had access to social protection or alternative employment. And lastly, with refugee resettlement, despite an estimated 1.4 million refugees in urgent need of resettlement globally, just under 23,000 refugees were resettled. This is the lowest refugee resettlement number in nearly 2 decades. The drop stems from low quotas put forward by countries such as the United States, which permitted only 15,000 refugees to arrive, as well as the impact of COVID-19, which delayed departures and shut down resettlement programs. While 20 countries resumed their resettlement programs, many more still need to. But by resuming their resettlement programs, these countries proved that the pandemic is no reason to stop admitting refugees and migrants. Just as with the citizens of any country, public health measures can make all of us safe. By the way, going back to Uganda and how it had shut its border to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the largest number of resettled refugees in 2020 originated from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, and Myanmar. Turning to the US, the story was much the same. As I briefly described before, immigrants and asylum seekers have faced an unending series of attacks over the past few years as the Trump administration has sought to scapegoat and exclude them at every turn. From excluding, traumatizing, and criminalizing people seeking safety at the US-Mexico border, to arbitrarily detaining them, the US asylum and detention policies have violated human rights and exacted tremendous human cost. This was before COVID-19. Since March 2020, asylum access at the Mexico-US border has been virtually suspended under something called Title 42. In other words, the border has been closed to people seeking safety. Only because a federal court intervened was the border open to unaccompanied children. Imagine this. The former administration closed the border to even children traveling alone who came here seeking safety. Using the pandemic as a pretext, the United States has unlawfully expelled tens of thousands of people, including families, under an order nominally issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which empowers border agents to summarily expel people to Mexico or rapidly return them to their countries of origin. The UN agency has made clear that blanket measures such as this restricting access to asylum cannot be justified. Yet, Title 42 continues. Furthermore, Title 42 does nothing to further the public health justifications on which it is purportedly based. Public health experts have repeatedly said there is no public health rationale for excluding asylum seekers and migrants. Before it suspended asylum at the border altogether, the US had forced tens of thousands of people seeking safety at our border to wait in dangerous, precarious conditions in Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy. Nearly 60,000 people were compelled to remain in Mexico while they underwent US asylum proceedings, still are ongoing US asylum proceedings, where they were left to the mercy of cartels and criminal elements, which regularly extort, kidnap, and assault them. In 2019, the US government strong-armed the governments of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras into signing a series of unsafe third country agreements, which offloads US obligations to process asylum claims to third countries whose conditions are anything but safe for asylum seekers. And in addition, we have immigration detention. The numbers of people detained ballooned under the Trump administration to over 50,000 people, with capacity driven by profit incentives that fueled egregious conditions and human rights abuses. The number of people detained decreased with the pandemic. That was because the border was closed and because of deportations, but it's now grown to around 15,000. So while the number is much smaller, we must remember the number shrank, not because of the choice of the prior administration to release people, but because it closed the border and it deported people. And sometimes because courts ordered people released because conditions were so unsafe due to COVID-19. The vast majority of people in ICE custody, and that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, are locked up in facilities owned or managed by private prison companies or state, county, or local jails. Detention also is in a sprawling network of over 200 facilities across the US. The United States has the largest immigration detention system in the world. COVID-19 has highlighted the dangers of detention, with illness sweeping through immigration detention facilities and impacting nearly 12,000 people in detention as of mid-April last year, a number that does not likely capture the extent of the virus's spread. ICE detention has drawn widespread concern and condemnation due to the mass numbers of immigrants and asylum seekers detained, the disparate racial impact of who is detained, the negligent medical care, and the due process barriers experienced by people in detention. As for resettlement, the US, as I explained before, has virtually shut down refugee resettlement. The prior administration abandoned its duty to share in the responsibility to protect refugees. Successive bans and policy changes have taken their toll, with many refugees who expected to be resettled to the US stuck in a never-ending limbo of security vetting. But let us not forget, against this backdrop of these punitive policies targeting refugees and asylum seekers, many of the frontline and essential workers are immigrants and refugees. They led the response, they led our recovery, and we owe them our thanks. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has warned that measures restricting access to asylum must not be allowed to become entrenched under the guise of public health. That is perhaps the greatest threat we face right now, that countries around the world, including the US, will use COVID-19 to continue to keep borders closed, to continue to expel people, to continue to deport people, which is not just a danger to those people by deporting them to countries where they could be harmed, but also potentially exposing them to COVID in their home countries. What is the way forward? The promise of the Biden administration agenda, with its stated commitment to human rights and racial justice, means that we have an opening and we are looking for transformative change. The new administration has taken welcome steps, but we are waiting for concrete commitments and that transformative change. We need the administration, President Biden, to commit to resettling 62,500 refugees this fiscal year and 125,000 refugees next fiscal year. We need the administration to transform the detention system, to end arbitrary detention, to implement a system where the presumption is liberty, not mandatory detention, to end the for-profit detention, and to end family detention altogether. We need the administration to stop the misuse of Title 42 and to address root causes that compel people to flee in the first place. And lastly, we need to set up equitable and safe and consistent pathways for climate migrants. At the heart, the solution is to uphold the rights of immigrants and people seeking safety without discrimination to their status, country of origin, or other characteristics, and implement a fair and humane immigration system that ensures the timely processing of asylum seekers and immigrants without the default use of detention. The desire to implement processes to regulate border entry can be achieved based on protecting public health and respecting human rights. The US has the capacity and must marshal the political will to act. The immigration system must and can be transformed, starting from the basis of protection, racial equity, and human rights. Rather than portraying asylum seekers and immigrants as categorical threats, our immigration system should be revised to communicate the valued place asylum seekers and immigrants have in the United States and our communities, and whose rights should be protected as equally as all others, rather than as people to be targeted. A rights-positive and equitable framework shapes not only public perception, but also institutional culture. The moment is now to build a more just, compassionate, and humane immigration system, one that does not punish and criminalize asylum seekers and immigrants, jeopardize human rights, and perpetuate the systemic harms of racial inequity and harmful narratives. It's time the government take bold action to transform how it welcomes children into this country at the southern border and ensure their human rights. Compassion and dignity must become the administration's leading lights, and the well-being of people seeking safety, the barometer for success. We've seen some of what the We've seen some of the worst of what the US can do. And now it's time for the US to envision its best and seize the window of opportunity to break out of the cycle of urgent response and criminalizing immigrants and asylum seekers. Let's be clear, the Biden administration has inherited a chaotic, punitive system that does not prioritize the well-being of people seeking safety in our country. Yet the administration cannot wait to deliver promised change. And no matter the situation or who's heading the administration, the government can't get out of its human rights obligations. We know from previous challenges that reform needs to start now, or else it will never happen. It's our legal and moral obligation to welcome people seeking safety, and it's their human right to ask for safety. It's time to double down, get it right, and make it better in both the short and long term. Amnesty International calls on the Biden administration to approach refugee and migrant rights with the urgency, accountability, and transparency they deserve. We can't be back here in another year. People's futures depend on it. Amnesty is working to ultimately transform the immigration system to one that is just, humane, and treats people with the dignity and respect they deserve and that human rights demands, and to restore the U.S. refugee program and U.S. global leadership on refugee protection. I invite you to join us at amnestyusa.org, and I urge you to use this opening for change and hold President Biden to the agenda he's promised, a country and vision with human rights and racial justice at their center. Thank you very much for joining me today at this inaugural symposium.
Thank you so much, Denise, for your speech. These are very deep and complex issues, and you addressed them so well and thoroughly. I was very grateful to hear about Amnesty's mission, human rights, especially in the United States. Of course, the former Trump administration and his detrimental policies, COVID-19, which has been very relevant, as well as future issues that will definitely need addressing, such as climate migration. And we're also so grateful to have had you here to talk about these issues in a compassionate way. As you said, refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers are not numbers. They're people with unique stories. And that's so important to remember as we talk about more of these issues today. When we talk about refugees, migrants, or asylum seekers, we're talking about our brothers, sisters, and siblings around the world. We all have one home on this planet Earth. So just remember that we must deliberately choose to move forward with compassion, love, and especially hope when we talk about these issues. So thank you again, Denise, for being here, albeit virtually, and your very important insights here today. We have so much gratitude for your ability to be here, and to our wonderful audience. Your presence means hope that future generations will be the change agents. So yeah, please tune in to the events throughout the day to keep learning and talking about these issues. Change does start here. So thank you again